Welcome. Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's virtual Tanner Talk. Members of this audience have registered from around the country and around the world, as far as Hawaii and Honolulu to New York and Washington, D.C., and even Paris, France. Thank you for being with us. We acknowledge that we are coming to you from Salt Lake City. We are here on the unceded ancestral territory of the Goshute, the Ute, the Eastern Shoshone and Paiute people, and we are utilizing the technology of Zoom. Based in San Jose, California, the unceded territory of the Ohlone people. We also must acknowledge that the prosperity that we enjoy is based in significant part on the labor of enslaved peoples. So thank you very much, and we acknowledge all that's gone into us being able to be here today. So I'm Erica George. I'm the director of the Tanner Humanities Center, and I'm also the Samuel D. Thurman Professor of Law at the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah. We are, with the Tanner Humanities, a gift from the Obert and Grace A. Tanner family. The Tanner Humanities Center promotes information, humanities exploration, and engagement through our programs, academic research, educational enrichment, and public outreach, in which we are engaged today, right now. So you are here with us for our Tanner Humanities at Home series with our special guest, Professor Safiya Noble of UCLA. I began the Tanner Talks in 2019 when I started in my new role at the Tanner Humanities Center as director, in large part because I saw a need for us to have sustained, intelligent, informed conversation about contested topics and contemporary issues. And that's our intention for today. I wanted to bring leading humanities scholars such as Professor Noble, public figures, faculty, lifelong learners and students together to explore new and interesting questions that confront us, ultimately to help us better understand our common and shared humanity. So our inaugural Tanner Talk was around this time last year, but live with Professor Ibram Kendi, who is currently the director of the Boston University Center for Anti-Racism Research and author of How to Be an Anti-Racist. In the fall, we were joined by Professor Rue Benjamin of Princeton University, and she is the founder of the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab and author of Race After Technology, of Abolitionist Tools for the New Jim Code. Our themes broadly for the series have recently been issues of equity and technology. And our current speaker is able to be with us because our generous sponsors have made it possible. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and appreciate them. Our diamond sponsor is the O.C. Tanner Foundation. They are our longtime supporters, and when I approached them with the idea for Tanner Humanities, Tanner Talks, they supported it with seed funding. So we are very grateful for them. Our additional sponsors represent a diverse range of our colleagues from across the campus and across the community who are interested in a focus on humanities and technology. These include our Emerald sponsors, the Communications, the College of Humanities, the Daniels Fund for Ethics and Initiative at the David Eccles School of Business, the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Office at the University of Utah, the Sorensen Legacy Foundation, and ZAP. This is our Zoo, Arts, and Parks program paid for by you, the Utah taxpayers. We are grateful. Our Ruby sponsors include the law firm of Holland and Hart, the Office of the Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, Pepsi, the Salt Lake City Mayor's Office, and the School of Computing, and X-Mission, founded by Pete Ashdown, a local tech firm here in Salt Lake. Our Sapphire in-kind sponsors are, again, the David Eccles School of Business and Digital Manners, which is our digital humanities program led by my colleague, Professor David Rowe. Also making this possible would be my dean in the College of Humanities, Stuart Culver, and my staff, the small and strong but mighty, including Beth James, my associate director, Susan Anderson, our development officer, and Katie Poya, our communications and marketing officer. We are joined by our postdoc fellows, our interns, both undergraduate and graduate, Professor Yamna El Said, who's our ACLS postdoctoral fellow for the College of Humanities, Scott McMurtry from the College of Law, Hannah Taub, who's our environmental humanities fellow, also interested in technology, and Isidore Neubecker, who is our student intern in the undergraduate college. So now, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Noble. Please monitor the chat. We will be populating the chat with more information about her work, and about this exciting, interesting new center that she's founded at UCLA. So Professor Noble is an associate professor at UCLA in the Department of Information Studies. She also serves as the co-founder, she initiated this, and co-director of UCLA's Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. She holds appointments in African American studies and gender studies, and her research is focused on algorithmic discrimination and technology bias. She's been appointed a commissioner for the Oxford Commission on AI and Good Governance, and she serves as a board member of the Civil Rights Initiative that I hope she will tell us more about. Her books include Algorithms of Oppression: How Search Engines Reinforce Racism, The Intersectional Internet: Race, Sex, Culture, and Class Online, and Emotions, Technology, and Design. We'll primarily be focusing on her most recent work, Algorithms of Oppression. Please use the Q&A function for questions for Professor Noble or myself, and I will begin our conversation. This will be an unscripted exchange focused on the research and work she's done most recently. And I wanted to begin with your introduction because it reminded me of some challenges we've recently faced here in Utah. You're coming to us from California, the home of Silicon Valley. We have Silicon Slopes.
Right.
And recently, the community was rocked by a disclosure, information about the founder of one of the tech firms in Silicon Slopes, Banjo, which is a security surveillance firm. It was disclosed that the CEO and founder of that firm once helped the KKK shoot up a synagogue. He was a member of the Ku Klux Klan and a white nationalist sympathizer, arguably in his past, but was responsible for a leading firm. Subsequent to these disclosures, he stepped down from that role. The state that had contracts with the firm canceled them. The university had contracts with that firm and canceled them. Your book is about the power of algorithms, but it's also about people. And you introduced the book with a letter that circulated around Google. I was hoping that you could share a bit about that letter, its substance, its contents with us, and why you selected to open the introduction to your book talking about what goes on internally and the kind of talk that was circulating at Google at the time.
Yes, well, wow, that's a powerful bit of a jumping off point. And I want to say thank you, Professor George, for this conversation, and for, all of my friends at the University of Utah. I'm really so honored to get to be in conversation with you today. Let's just jump right in. I mean, one of the reasons why I opened the book with this letter from James Damore, who he's a former employee of Google at the time that he wrote this letter, kind of an open letter to the company. He was an engineer who worked on search. So I thought that was only appropriate to kind of foreground this very widely circulated news story about this letter that he had written in response to the company's, alleged commitment to diversifying the workforce and to thinking about issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of broadly at the company. And of course, we can double click on that. And as we talk today, in terms of, how that's worked out for Google. But at the time, Damore's letter was very strongly supported by a lot of people in the engineering organization and across Google. And in his letter, he argues that fundamentally women and ethnic minorities are incapable of doing the kind of complex computer science and rigorous work that is required to be, a star kind of, engineer at Google. And, he starts making a lot of arguments about that are kind of, these are arguments about, for example, gender and sex that are, these would be debunked in a high school gender studies class, right? These would be arguments that we fully could just like eviscerate in 15 minutes in a gender studies course, or in an ethnic studies or African American studies course, where we would, of course, talk about things like the social construction of race and gender, how traits are not innate to one's biology, right? That you are, doomed to never be a good mathematician or computer scientist because you are a woman, right? I mean, we would just, we have so much research and knowledge to unpack that. And yet here he is working on search. And of course, this book is mostly about Google search and other kinds of recommending engines. And this is kind of an exemplar of the type of employee who's making the kinds of results, right? Or the kinds of systems that give us the results that I then, really bring forward in the book. And I think it's important for us to understand that, you cannot divorce the value systems, the values, the politics, the views of technology designers from the technologies that they make. This is one of the largest kind of, I would say, broadest misnomers that those of us who are in information science or science and technology studies, communications, media studies in these fields, we understand that technologies are also a social construct. These are also, framed by who we imagine the user to be, where we imagine the deployment of the technology to be, who is a priority as we're kind of thinking through design decisions. And it's really disheartening to hear that someone working at a top level security firm holds these views. But I have to tell you that some of the most technologically savvy people in the United States are people who are white supremacists and white nationalists. I mean, you go back to the early parts of kind of Web 1.0, Stormfront, which is one of the largest white supremacist organizations on the internet, has been on the internet as long as the rest of us have been on the internet, right? And they have been an extremely well organized community, and they have an incredible amount of technical skill. And really throughout the book, I try to show examples too of where white supremacists and white nationalists have used their powerful technical prowess to make technologies and to manipulate search engine results and these kinds of things in service of their worldview and their belief systems. So of course, it's disheartening, but on another level, it's important that we know that people who are, let's say, making securities for, surveillance securities that might be used by law enforcement and other kinds of security agencies, well, we know that those are typically pointed toward poor people, communities of color, and it's very important, I think, that we know kind of the origin story of those technologies.
Yeah, thank you. It was a shocking way to start the book, and it gave me lots of food for thought, particularly since we're coping with relatively recent news about who's shaping and making and creating technologies that we rely on and presume to be neutral and objective. So there's another example in this book. This book I highly recommend. It's rich in examples. There'll be information in the chat about how you can access this book. I wanted to share with you, I am a human rights lawyer. I come from the law school. Law is a humanities. We are interested in the human condition. You also have an example of a UN ad campaign. In this ad campaign, UN women help to interrogate the search engine. You tell a story about how that ad system was structured. And it's something that I was really excited about. I was excited that the UN was taking on questions of technology, and they auto-populated search superimposed over women's images. Women should, and then just let the search engine populate. I'll let you share some of the things that came up. But you argue that we may not necessarily take this as a mirror of what society thinks, that perhaps that's too simple to assume, even though there's sexism, that truly we are all searching for things that are just that sexist. Could you
So,
describe that for us?
I'm happy to. It's so interesting because I'm sitting here having a low-key panic attack about a lot of specifics that are in the book because
Oh,
I wrote the book so long ago.
yes.
But listen, I will say that I know this campaign really well because here we had kind of Ogilvy, which is a huge global ad firm that does this campaign for the United Nations, right? And one of the things that exactly as you describe, they take images of women from different parts of the world, and over their mouths, they kind of overlay a search box with autocomplete kind of happening right over their mouths. And one of the kinds of auto completes are things like people are typing women should and the Google auto completes, you know, stay at home, not speak, all of these kinds of like really derogatory, sexist stereotypes, right? Stay in their place kinds of messages, um, know their place. Uh, and and the campaign is using this to illuminate how pervasive sexism is in societies around the world. And there is no question that that is indeed true. Right. So, this is a very important campaign. And I highlight it because I feel like it is telling part of the story, but not the whole story. And it's really an opening because the campaign really reflects the public's general understanding of what a search engine is, which is to say that most people believe that a search engine is giving them back what is most credible, right? That there's some algorithm that's helping them sort through millions of potential results to give them the best ones. So they believe that. But they also believe that when there's a problem, if something comes back like sexist results or racist results, that's because that's what the public has been looking for, and that the search results are really purely a reflection of what the public thinks. Like they kind of use this like false mirror type of idea,
I do that. Yeah.
right? All right. So I try to use this as an opening in the book to say, okay, this is the pervasive way that people think about search engines and search engine results, but that's not it. Yes, there is plenty of sexism in the world, but the truth is that women really have a very hard time controlling the way in which we are represented in these search engine results. So how is it that the most derogatory, the most racist, the most sexist kinds of results stand as a proxy in a system that people think is providing them with the truth? So now we have to complicate what's going on here in these systems. And really, the whole book is about doing this. And one of the reasons I do this is because, one, I want people to understand that search engines are actually advertising portals, full stop. They are commercial advertising engines. They are not knowledge spaces necessarily. You could find knowledge in there, but you can also find a lot of things that are not knowledge. They are not a substitute for a library or for what a teacher can provide for you or other kinds of information spaces. And so I try to really help us understand that search, and of course, one of the reasons why people don't understand is because Google and other large scale commercial platforms like it disavow that the results that come up in searches are of their own making. Right, they put it back on the public, and one of the worst examples is Jessie Daniels talks about this in her very important book, Cyber Racism, where she describes how white supremacists and white nationalists are very active in manipulating the kinds of things that we find in search, and one of the like most famous cases was on the word Jews. And that for many years, right, when you did searches on the keyword Jews, the whole front page was almost completely white supremacist disinformation websites that denied the Holocaust, and there were anti-Semitic. And Google's response when the Anti-Defamation League asked them about this, wrote them a letter and said, "What is going on here?" They said, "Hey, the search results are just the search results. We're not really responsible for search." And of course, my question is, if Google's not responsible for their own product results, then who is? right? And so this is part of the tension, and why people are confused is because the company itself is actively disavowing its responsibility for its own product.
Thank you. That's great. Actually, good news story out of Utah, not just white supremacists in Silicon Slopes. Our state legislature actually recently passed a resolution that we should have more education about the Holocaust here in Utah. So this clearly would be
That is good
relevant
news.
to how we structure that and how we advise people to search. I did want to get to that example a bit later in our conversation. I'll share for the audience at home, thank you for being at Tanner Humanities at Home, that this book is organized into 6 chapters. The first one is a society searching, which interrogates what it is we look for and why that UN example of women in ads is so critically important. The next chapter is called Searching for Black Girls. And I wanted to invite you to tell me about the search that got you started on this path and the surprising results.
Sure. Well, I was in grad school at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, actually with studying with people like Professor Kent Ono, who's now at Utah, and my wonderful colleague, Dr. Myra Washington, who I also went to grad school with. And, we were all in these incredible media and communications and information science courses. And I was thinking about how I had just left the advertising industry. And, I was really I was aware that the way we were using search engines was kind of like through our media buying channels. I was writing advertorial to try to make it look like legitimate news that could make it to the front page for my clients. And I left that industry and I was coming to grad school. And taking these incredible courses with faculty at Illinois and the Institute for Communications Research. And we were always thinking about like these challenging edges of technology companies. And, this is kind of the early days of social media, early days of Facebook. Google was in the full throes of its Google book digitization project. Siva Vaidyanathan had written this incredible book called The Googleization of Everything and Why We Should Worry, which profoundly influenced me. And one of the things that I loved about that was that, he was kind of talking about, hey, everybody, be careful here with this company called Google. But I was thinking, there's something missing here because there's something different that happens for minoritized people, for ethnic and racial and sexual minorities in these spaces. And I knew that. And so I was really trying to think about like the future of knowledge, the future of culture, and what happens when something like a big search engine becomes the portal to culture and knowledge and information. And I kind of stumbled upon through conversation and through my own exercises doing this keyword search on Black girls. And at the time, my stepdaughter was about, I don't know, probably 10 or 11, 12. And I was thinking about her and I was stunned that when I did a search on Black girls, 80% of the first page was pornography. Now, I'll keep it PG rated, but I will tell you that it was, in a lot of like, explicit pornography that was all over the first page. And I thought, how is it that you don't have to add the word sex and you don't have to add the word porn, but Black girls are synonymous with pornography and sexual exploitation and kind of a commodification of our sexual identities. And of course, these porn sites are women. So, allegedly. So, women are fundamentally coded as girls. And then there's no space for girls, for children. And I thought, this is the thread that will help me illuminate and unpack what's happening in these systems. And of course, here years later, a decade later, still when you look for Latina girls and Asian girls, you will often find sexually explicit or sexually commodified kinds of sites that come to the first page. Google has done a lot. I've been speaking obviously for a decade. They've really pushed down the porn when it comes to Black girls. I actually think of my book as being like a big book of tickets that they just like, let's fix all this. But there's this fundamental concern over the loss of control over our own identity markers, or the way in which knowledge about ourselves and our communities are represented in these spaces, is profound and important to me, because it's such a banal kinds of technology that people rely upon so heavily.
Yeah. And I think when you shared that story, how you came upon the search so innocently, trying to find information that your daughter might be interested in, and to be surprised with the result in that way. So thank you for the work you do, because it has made an impact in the world. I'll share that my students are also reading this book, and so they've gone off and done their own searches, and did find that still for Latino women, not necessarily in Google, but in Instagram searches, problems remain. And this will remain a PG conversation, but it's troubling. The third chapter you have is searching for people in communities. I really had to do some soul searching on this one. This summer was a rough summer for multiple reasons for many of us, between the pandemic, but also the murder of George Floyd.
Yeah.
I'm a law professor, tons of questions, tons of questions, tons of questions, and then questions from friends, casual acquaintances, people I'm in book groups with. Eric, is this true? Is this really the disproportionate impact? Is this true? Is that? And I just wanted to say, just go Google it. Why would that impulse of mine have been extraordinarily unhelpful? Reading your third chapter and the situation about Charlottesville that you lay out helped me understand how I needed to just get some more patience from somewhere and continue conversations. Why can't I just default to go Google?
Yeah. That chapter was a really tough chapter to write, and I wrote it in real time as the story of the mass murder of 9 African Americans at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, by Dylan Roof was happening. I remember where I was in my apartment, watching this story break. And of course, like everyone who's a researcher or interested, was trying to figure out who was Dylan Roof and what was happening. And of course, within about, well, listen, this is like a pro tip. Don't do anything that you don't want found, because someone on Twitter is going to find it. Okay. So that's just like a free knowledge here. Within about 24 hours, someone on Twitter had found Dylan Roof's kind of online manifesto. And in, here's Dylan Roof. He's a, white man who has committed this atrocious murder. And in his online manifesto, which is then later authenticated by the FBI, he says, I'm pouring through it. I'm trying just to, as a Black woman, I'm just trying to make sense. I'm not even writing this for the book. I'm just traumatized, like every trauma. I mean, I don't even think I got out of bed for days after the murder of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman. So I'm, just like everyone, trying to save myself and understand. And here comes Dylan Roof in his manifesto, and this part just jumped out at me in his manifesto. He says in his own words that he is trying to make sense of the news reporting about Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman. He doesn't understand. Now, one of the things you want to remember for students who are watching this, who might be too young to really remember when Trayvon Martin was murdered, that as we were moving toward the trial of George Zimmerman, the nation, the United States, was completely divided racially over this case. When pollsters asked African Americans about whether George Zimmerman should be convicted of murder and whether he was guilty, overwhelmingly, African Americans solidly say guilty, murder, he should go to prison. When they ask white Americans report out the exact opposite. Not guilty. He was just doing his job. Now, mind you, he had no job. His job, he was a self-appointed neighborhood watch captain. He is no justification, no authority. So this is what's happening. George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin are in the news constantly, nightly, weekly. And Dylan Roof says he's trying to make sense of what is this story about. So he does a Google search, And he says he starts Googling, and he eventually Googles black on white crime. Now, this is interesting because black on white crime is like a classic racist red herring. I mean, you will see this phrase in white nationalist and white supremacist blogs and kind of disinformation sites all over the internet, right? Purportedly that Black people murdering white Americans is like of epic proportion and is the most important existential threat to white America, which of course anyone who's Black is like, no, I don't think so, because we would be hearing about Black people murdering white people trust, and that would get shut down with some tanks. So we already know that that's not even a thing. But here's what's interesting. When you did the search at the time, you didn't get FBI statistics, for example, that show that violent crime and homicides are an intra-racial phenomenon. So we have phrases like black on black crime. People are really familiar with this type of a phrase, that the majority of Black people are murdered by other Black people. Well, let me add to it white on white crime, because the majority of white people are also killed by other white people, because violent crime is an intra-racial phenomenon. So you don't get FBI statistics. You don't get anything that helps reframe. You don't even get anything from like Black studies or a history of racial tyranny in the United States that would disprove this idea. And Dylan Roof says in his manifesto that he starts searching deeper and deeper. And then he finds out about the Jewish problem. And he finds out about all these things that basically the bill of goods he's been sold about a multiracial America being, the dream, is actually a lie. And he says at the end, now I am completely racially aware. And this becomes the pretext of his education that then motivates his desire to start a race war, and that leads to the murder of these 9 African Americans. So for me, this is so crucial, because here's Dylan Roof, he's 21, and I think of my students, all of my students over the last decade, and how they just turn to Google to understand the world, to understand headlines, to make sense of things, and how incredibly dangerous that is, because these sites are not curated by subject matter experts, right? The kinds of things that you can so easily find are things that can be manipulated by people, like I said, who have an incredible amount of technical skill or money to make their content go to the top. And I think that this is an incredible threat to our society when we start talking about really serious and important issues like racism, economic exploitation, class issues of gender and sexuality. We should not fully leave it to a search engine to answer those questions.
Wonderful, thank you. And actually, just in this conversation right now, I learned a new word, advertorials?
Advertorial, yeah.
Okay, so one of the things you also make clear in this book is how unclear we are on what it is we're looking at. Even those of us who are educated, having difficulty distinguishing between fact, news, opinion, editorial, and outright disinformation. The next chapter you have in this book concerns searching for protection from search engines. And you introduce the idea of a right to be forgotten, a right to erasure. I am still sorting out where I am on that, because I think of someone's history, like I was formerly in the Ku Klux Klan. How long do people get to remember that? Or you give examples actually in the book primarily of women who've fallen afoul of too much information disclosed in privacy. I'd just like to invite you to comment on the intersection of privacy and data and how it's shared.
Well, data privacy is in the headlines all the time, right? States are passing propositions and legislation around data privacy. We're having more conversations at the federal level. Of course, the EU with GDPR and, all kinds of responses to these ideas about data privacy. And of course, there are really important scholars. I think of somebody like Wendy Chun at Simon Fraser University, who helps us understand that our data is actually never private, right? That the struggle is that our data is always public, right? And so, it's kind of a false idea that we're somehow even ever able to be private. Once you do something on the internet, it is public. Either kind of by looking at the network, depending on your skill level, not just what's captured in a search engine or indexed. So I try to explain that one of the challenges here is the way that power works to shield and protect some people, namely the more powerful people in many different societies, and how too much visibility or kind of a hyper visibility in these spaces um, forecloses a sense of future for people or can have incredibly damaging effects. So I give examples like, the elderly woman who in the 1950s or in some young portion of her life might have taken some risque photos, right? And now she's fired from driving a bus or being a volunteer at a school. I mean, this is ludicrous, but yet this is one of the ways. I talk about a teacher who is a highly decorated woman. She works with at-risk kids. She is a phenomenal teacher, and she goes through a terrible divorce, and her ex-husband sends photos of her unclothed to her principal, the whole school board, really just, this is like revenge porn or non-consensual, pornography. And she loses her job, right? She's demoted. She's in a legal case now fighting for her life, not only because she's just become a single mom because she's divorced, but also she's now, her whole livelihood is threatened around something that was a private sharing and a private matter, but the circumstances change. So these issues about the threat of being hyper visible or of information, right, being used or weaponized against people, I think is really important, because the people who are most vulnerable, women, girls, people who are not, let's say, the head of state, right, who are not, large scale, like powerful public people, really have a lot to lose. And we see this. And one of the reasons, I point to some, early work around why we think it's important to, and I think here of the work of like my colleague, Jean-Francois Blanchette, who has argued with his writers, his team of writers, that there's a reason we seal juvenile records, for example, because when you do something when you're 15 or 17, maybe that shouldn't follow you the rest of your life. We understand the social value of forgetting. And that's one of the things he argues about, the value of forgetting. We know some memories should be kept alive, but some memories should fade in order to flourish. And so these are the kinds of tensions that are before us when we talk about search engines gathering up everything. And then, of course, they gather up a lot of false things. So there's a New York Times article, I don't know, last month or so, about the woman who has a vendetta against a former employer and populates, right? Did you see that?
Yes,
populates all these websites, takes down him and his whole family.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the whole family goes down. Then you find out this woman has like orchestrated these smear campaigns against all kinds of people. Now, these are wealthy British people who have to like try to fight. They're white. Imagine if you're poor, if you're working class, if you're a person of color, you're a woman, you don't have the resources to do like reputation management, to clean the internet of the things, that the lies that have been written about you. And now you can't get a job. Now you're fired from your job. Now your future is ruined. And I think these are incredibly important issues. I really feel strongly about this in terms of children or people under the age of 30. Let's say if your brain is not fully developed yet, maybe the things that you put on the internet shouldn't over determine your future, and you should have a right to take them down.
Yeah, I think this is an important conversation space to watch, because there's so many intersecting issues and rights and interests. And as you say, the power asymmetry on who is deciding to store, to share, and when and where information. The next chapter you have actually is the future of knowledge in the public. Here, I was absolutely fascinated because you don't just talk about the public, you talk about the past. And I learned quite a bit about the Library of Congress subject headings. And I wondered if you could share a couple of the examples. And I know you wrote this a long time ago, so I
It's
encourage you
okay.
the ones that I
I
thought
know
were
that
really
one.
compelling. Okay.
Yeah.
But the evolution of how we came to change classification. So the classification of undocumented immigrant, how did we come to that? Where did we start? And then how did we actually finally get to Jewish as opposed to what it had been in the past?
Right. Okay. Listen. So I mentioned that I come out of the field of library and information science, right? I got a master's and a PhD in that field, and I love this field because it's so interdisciplinary. Everything from children's librarians to communications and sociologists to computer scientists, all in this field. And so I was writing this book. This chapter is for the field of library and information science or information studies for the practitioners. One of the things that I try to illuminate is with this case study about the librarians at Dartmouth University, right? So Dartmouth, or is it college? So Dartmouth librarians are approached by students, Latino and Latina students who are really concerned that as they're doing research and trying to uh, work on research around their own identities and their own communities, that they're coming up against this term illegal alien, right? And they're like, this is not it. This is not the way. First of all, we say undocumented people. Now we don't call people illegal aliens. This is like a term that's fallen out of favor and for a lot of important good reasons. So they take this, and the Dartmouth librarians take it up all the way up to the Library of Congress. It's a super interesting story. And they're trying to get because the Library of Congress sets the subject headings that really govern a lot of the cataloging systems for libraries in the United States. This is very important, the Library of Congress subject headings. And they are petitioning the Library of Congress to change this term or to kind of add or make primary undocumented people versus illegal alien. And this becomes a political football where eventually the Republicans in Congress threaten the budget of the Library of Congress. This is their own library, right?
Yeah.
They threaten it. They're like, if you change this from illegal alien, your funding is in jeopardy. So it becomes like incredibly politically contested in DC. And I give this example to show that, and other examples, as you mentioned, right? How 3 generations ago, if you looked at Library of Congress subject headings for Jewish people, you would find, these really derogatory subject headings, which is how Jewish people are classified. Asian Americans classified as yellow peril. I mean, can you believe this? This is like, you can't even imagine it in 2021, but here we were with, the Negro problem. This is how Black people, right, with the Negro question, right, or problem. So here we have these, what these examples show us is that knowledge and ideas and who controls the narrative about people, even in libraries, is contested. It's very difficult for minoritized people to have control over how they are framed up in knowledge spaces. So imagine how much more difficult it is when we go out to the open web. But the thing that's different about librarians is that we know that these are subjective. They're subject headings. I mean, we understand them also as subjective, and that they change over time. And of course, we've seen a tremendous amount of this around LGBTQ subject headings, and still have a lot of work to do there. So I try to challenge the people who are responsible for the future of organizing knowledge for hundreds and thousands of years ahead of us to also be incredibly mindful about what we're doing here and how we're doing it, and then also to bring their expertise and knowledge out to the open web. And this is a project that we're going to be working on at the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry, which is thinking about what is the future of like internet librarianship also look like, right? Where you could have more guidance and more support to make sense of, the complex nature of knowledge.
Yeah, I think the tremendous contribution of your book, and I'm now going to turn to audience questions, including one from, and I say this with as a term of endearment, an information sciences library nerd, our law librarian has sent me a question.
Okay.
But you really challenge us to interrogate questions of, is this neutral? Is this subjective? And is this even the appropriate thing for private actors to be doing, as say distinct from public actors and teachers and information holders and librarians? So I think that you really help us think through control over information, and how is it that we make sense of it all? Is that unassisted? Is that with an assist? How is that shaped? How is that shaded? And certainly scholars have a role to play in that.
Yeah.
This first question comes from Beth Jennings. Um, she says that many libraries rely on copy cataloging. Maybe this makes sense to you, when entering new works in the library collection. Copy cataloging allows a library to import a pre-existing bibliographic record instead of generating a new record from scratch. In the US, libraries typically use OCLC as the source for their cataloging copy, and they can edit or expand the record if they wish. I read your book, I searched the records of some libraries and found that they carry algorithms of oppression. And I found that some libraries included as few as 3 subject headings for your book, Google search engines discrimination, and some libraries included as many as 20. Subject headings as varied as neoliberalism, racism, pornography, and obscenity. So what role do you see us librarians playing in rooting out racism from our library catalogs and increasing access to information like yours? I guess in that question is presumed if there are fewer ways to find you, you might not be found.
That's right. Okay, this is such a great question. And I know it is, we like to nerd out on these like technical dimensions. So I'll try to take this question up, a notch so that everybody can kind of get in on it. It is true that the words we use to describe a book, a film, an artifact that might be cataloged in a library, an archive, a museum, the words we use to describe those artifacts are really important. We call that metadata, right? And so it's the information about the object. And discovery, how we can discover knowledge, is really important, and it's changed. It's changed over time in a lot of different ways. First of all, that the enterprise of librarianship is so vast that you might have, a few publishers who really kind of control the information environment, even in a library. And so their practices are really, really important, because libraries aren't just cataloging every book that comes in their doors themselves, right? They are using these kind of other systems that have been scaffolded up by other companies, right? So this is important. And many times authors themselves don't even have a say in the way in which our work is described. So we're relying on these companies. And of course, if you put that in tension with something like the public getting acculturated to using search engines, now you have an even bigger challenge, which is, if you're not in the library, you're doing keyword searches in a search engine, and you're probably using only a few words, right? That's a training. That's a kind of a training that you've been involved in for the last decade or more. Now you go to the library and you use just a couple of words or 2 or 3 words to try to get at. And if those words aren't connected to a book, my book or anybody else's book, it will not pop up in the database, right? So this is important, because we're talking about trying to open up access to lots of ideas. Now, compare that with what it was like when you were a kid and you walked around the library. You walked through the stacks, you explored, you found a book, and then you found all these other kinds of books around it, like a context. You're like, oh my gosh, I thought I wanted this. I want this and this and this and this now too, right? And you left the library with a big stack of books. This is me as a kid. So I think it's like we have these tensions of the digital structuring, and in some ways we think of it as opening up, but in some cases it's also narrowing what we might find, right? And I will tell you that some libraries, some academic libraries now, they keep all the holdings off site. You use the database to call up what you want and somebody brings it over in a day. So these things, this is one of the things I really argue for, is that we need to double down on public information spaces like libraries. I really feel strongly about that. School libraries, schools, public schools. I mean, what we have is now an information environment and ecosystem where we have a narrowing and a foreclosing through some of these digital technologies rather than a more expansive. And it is complex. I'm not making that as a blanket statement, but I will say that there is a lot at stake, especially for voices and ideas, again, that have traditionally not been included in the canon of important thinking, like feminist knowledge, like critical race knowledge, ethnic studies, scholars of color. I mean, we're just, have been in the United States for 100 years, contributing, able to contribute, and then sometimes our work is erased or made invisible through some of these processes.
Okay. I know we only have 5 more minutes of your time.
My answers are too long. I'm sorry.
No. They're thorough, and we don't want to truncate. That's the whole point. So what I'm going to do is curate a bit, consolidate, name those who've brought the questions, and try to invite you to speak to whatever you'd like. So okay. Zachary Stickney loves your book, Dr. Noble, among one of my favorites in this field, wants to ask you about the federated learning of cohorts, Google's new that. So if you can speak to that, I'm not sure what that is, but he's concerned about fixing privacy issues and a new way browsers could enable interest-based advertising on the web. So this may be about targeted advertising or a new Google initiative. Amanda Woods is interested in creating diverse and inclusive teams. She's a student in the Business Scholars Program. How can she do better? Recommendations. Cicely Joseph is actually a colleague who is in Silicon Valley. She's interested in security web filtering tools, blocking child porn, but also blocking LGBTQ-oriented sites. Sahil, I will apologize on your name. Thank you for being here. I love your work. He is asking you a pointed question about public figures and erasure of the past, citing the right to be forgotten. And maybe there needs to be separate criteria for politicians, bureaucrats, academic journalists, not necessarily movie stars, but different people are different. Maybe we have different scales of protection. Those are the ones I saw. Oh, and then our colleague in Digital Matters, David Rowe, suggests that part of the problem is the black box nature of the algorithm. Is there room to open algorithms and subject them to the inspection and scrutiny to the public? Can we reconceive the need of accountability and corporate accountability in this confidential space? And then there's a bunch of librarians in this chat sharing information and resources. Thank you, Melissa Bernstein. So.
Okay, this is going to be a tough one because some of these are extremely specific. Some of them I actually haven't, looked closely enough at yet to publicly opine on. So I'm sorry that I'm not gonna and also I'm like middle-aged and I can't even hold this many questions in my mind at one time. All right, so let me start with the last one because it's the freshest one that I can actually grab a hold of, and maybe that'll unfold some things. I think that these environments, these networks, digital environments are complex spaces and places. And one of the challenges that we have here is we have a near kind of corporate monopoly over the landscape. And we have a very hard time even disambiguating what is in these spaces. And part of that is because the tech companies themselves are avoidant around their responsibility, especially, you see this more so in social media, but of course it really applies to Google too, especially around YouTube and search, which is this kind of flattening of what is happening in their spaces because they don't want to be accountable as publishers of content, right? So they use, they use a portion of the federal code that is called Section 230, and I won't get into that because it's that you can read about this all over. But I will say that they have invented words like content to flatten what we understand we're experiencing. And this is one of the challenges for me about a word like content. Is content evidence-based research? Is it a book that's been published? Or is it racist propaganda? It's all called content in like social media and other kinds of platforms. So I think that, part of what we're dealing with is like the terms of engagement, the terms of art that are used by the public and how we can make sense of it. Now, there are so many different ways that people are trying to intervene, and filtering software is one of the challenges here, because we know that, for example, schools, this is a longstanding public library concern, not wanting patrons to get on and look at pornography. And so using certain kinds of filters like breast, and then everything about breast cancer cannot be found, right? So these tensions are long standing conversations that have been happening for a very long time, more than 20 years. I would really invite people to look at some of that literature. Public librarians have written a lot about this. And so, I think, yes, of course, we know that LGBT communities have been disproportionately harmed. They've also had, the internet has been a space for those communities to also make connection and community, because in some places, nobody wants to roll up to the public librarian reference desk and ask about, books on sexuality, right? So it's a complex environment. I think my last headline would be that I think that the tech sector broadly has really bankrupted our ability to make more complex, robust information and knowledge spaces, because they don't pay taxes. You're in Silicon Slope, I live in Silicon Beach, Silicon Valley is up the road. All of these kind of Silicon corridors are places that get massive tax subsidies, right? They don't pay taxes, or they pay very, very low. And so those resources are the resources that would go in to bolster these other kinds of spaces for knowledge and information seeking. And so there's like also a bit of a symbiotic relationship here between how they then insert themselves to develop new technologies, new campaigns, new efforts. Kind of going to the first question, of providing solutions from the very systems that they've helped to break.
Wonderful. Well, please join me in thanking Professor Noble for her time. I know she needs to sign off to prepare for yet another thing.
Thank you.
Thank you. As she's doing that, thank you. I appreciate you so much. As she's doing that, I wanted to share with you that these conversations will continue. Fall semester, we're excited to announce that we have secured Professor Shoshana Zuboff, who is the author of Surveillance Capitalism. She will be our Tanner Lecturer on Human Values. This is the book we discussed today. If you check the chat, there's information about how you can order it. We also have a limited number of copies to distribute to our audience today. Please check that link. It's really kind of first comes, first serve. I actually don't know how many we have, but we had some. And then the other thing I wanted to invite you to is a series of sci-fi and artificial intelligence book clubs we've been doing with two of our stellar faculty from the College of Humanities, my colleague Jeremy Rosen in English and my colleague Andrew Shepard in English. So please check our website. Please follow us on our social media channels. Please be safe online, and please continue to seek information. So we so appreciate our lifelong learners and our audience. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next time. Have a good day.